ikamoana, kamoana hohon, di kaleva lu, ikahikina, ayakala, eala e.
5 o'clock alarm bell rings, same thing every day. Bell answer the phone, I'm not home, I'm already on my way. Out the door, down the street, got to keep me on my feet. I got coffee, I got donuts, in the office down the street. And the fat hat lady's faking a heart attack. And my manager yelling at me, say, can't give her money back. Thank God the note is overdue. And that's just one more thing I gotta do till I get on to you. Till I get on to you. 12 o'clock, the lunch bell rings. Same thing every day. You better answer the phone in the proper tone. Yes, sir, whatever you say. Right on time, on the time. Got to keep me on my feet. I got contracts, I got lawyers in the office down the street. Jam is backing up, more than I can stand. Things ain't working out the way I had them planned. Thanks on the meeting, just a drink or two. That's just one more thing I gotta do till I get on to you. Till I get on to you. Till I get on to you. Till I get on to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on this Rising Voices session on water. We wanted to open up with just acknowledging the life that water brings to us in our communities and in all of the work, as we are going to be spending some time today kind of discussing our own experiences working with water. We also wanted to acknowledge our friend Janan, who was going to be joining us today to offer a water ceremony. And because she was unable to join us this morning, we are sharing some photos that we have pulled from a previous meeting in Duluth, Minnesota for Rising Voices a few years ago. And we were able to come together and share water with each other and in ceremony, and wanted to just spend some time, maybe just 30 seconds, reflecting on water in our lives with the images that you also get to see that are showing today. Thank you.
And with that, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Melissa, for that beautiful opening, and hope that those images can transport us all back to times when we were together in person on the beautiful shores of the lake. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy that you've joined us again today for the panel discussion on water systems for this installment of the Rising Voices 8 meeting. I'm Heather Lazarus with the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and together with Julie Maldonado from Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network and wonderful support from the Olohana Foundation and Lomakai Media, we've taken Rising Voices online for our series of interactions this summer. A wee bit of background for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Rising Voices, including our panelists today. Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences, some of our panelists I should say, facilitates intercultural relational-based approaches for understanding and adapting to extreme weather events, climate variability, and climate change. The program brings together Indigenous and other scientific professionals, tribal and community leaders, environmental and communication experts, students, educators, artists, and others from across the United States, including Alaska, Hawaii, and the Pacific and Caribbean islands, and around the world, to assess critical community needs, and to pursue joint research aimed at developing optimal plans for community action towards sustainability. And Rising Voices we all acknowledge the inherent value of Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous science, adaptive processes and practices, and honors them equally with earth sciences. Really, at its core, Rising Voices aims to advance science through collaborations that bring Indigenous and earth sciences, including atmospheric, social, biological, ecological sciences, into partnership to support adaptive and resilient communities through sharing scientific capacity, building trust. It supports adaptive and resilient communities through building this scientific capacity, and provides opportunities for Indigenous students and early career scientists through scientific and community mentoring, and as well as helps Western trained scientists explain their observation skills, their research paradigms and capacities to apply and translate findings and ultimately their science towards these goals. This month, with this installment of the Rising Voices 8 virtual meeting, we will have a panel session on water systems, which we're thinking of inclusively of both marine and freshwater systems. Building off of all of our previous discussions, we'll continue to think about the really important nexus between all the topics from community relocation and site expansion, phenology, energy systems, and now water systems in particular. The panel today will build towards the water systems working group session that we really hope you'll all join us for again on August 21st, Friday the 21st. And now it's a wonderful honor to get to hand this back to Melissa Watkinson, who, along with Carletta Chief, have generously taken on the roles of moderator for today. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Heather. So I have the honor of opening up our water discussion. I wanted to kind of give a brief background on myself, and then I'll let Carletta introduce herself, and just a bit different kinds of perspectives around water that we're bringing to the table here. We also wanted to acknowledge the speakers that are joining us today and thank them for sharing their knowledge with us. So I work at Washington Sea Grant as a social scientist, and I have the honor of working with coastal tribes on projects related to climate change, and a lot of times that means working on impacts to the ocean and marine foods and resources that a lot of Indigenous peoples in the area depend on. I live in Bremerton, Washington, the traditional lands of the Suquamish peoples. I grew up in Washington State, and I have family ties with the Upper Skagit community, growing up with access to salmon and crab and shellfish, and having that be a large component of our family gatherings when we came together. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, also descend from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, so I also have heritage there. It's important for me to be able to do this work not only for the folks who are experiencing a decline in some of the resources and relationships and first foods within our oceans and marine ecosystems that I'm familiar with here in Washington State, but also for future generations, and particularly my nieces, who I hope to be able to grow up and enjoy these relationships as I have growing up. And we, have these different marine ecosystems across these different coasts and across the Pacific that a lot of Indigenous peoples have different relationships and rely on heavily. So we have Joe Hostler, who's joining us today from the Yurok tribe, presenting on some knowledge around that region, as well as Natalie Michelle joining us from Maine. So she'll present on some experiences there. And yeah, I'll go ahead and pass it along to Carletta, and then we'll give some information about what kinds of questions the folks that are joining us today will be responding to.
Yeah, it's also he had quite a shot the whole sense at the whole day. Dona Shinigi Ea Torachi Nishlo Tohana Bashichin as a Sunday Dashiche Do Ya Edine Tajine Dashinala Akota a Sunanshle. Good morning, everyone out there across the world. It's an honor to be here on this virtual platform, speaking to you, relating to the precious waters of our Indigenous peoples. And my name is Carletta Chief. I'm Bitterwater, born for near the water. My maternal grandfather is Many Goats, and my paternal grandfather is Red Running into the Water. This is how I identify myself as a Dene woman and mother wife. And today I will be joined by my panelists, Dr. Otakuye Conroy Ben from Arizona State University, and Janine Yazi from Six World Solutions. And our panelists, I'll be focusing on freshwater systems. And freshwater systems include tribal water resources such as rivers, lakes, wetlands, springs, groundwater, permafrost, snowpack, glaciers, estuary, oceans, sea ice. So all of these freshwater sources are used in many different ways by our Indigenous people. And they span all the different uses from not only drinking water, but also for spiritual and cultural uses, to maintain health, and to support livelihoods that our people maintain. And so climate change impacts freshwater resources in many different ways. And there are various factors to consider, such as the political factors, the infrastructure that we have, ecosystem services and land use that our people practice, the spirituality and cultural factors, and then even the socioeconomic factors. And so the work that I do is really focused on working with Indigenous scientists, such as Dr. Otakuye Conroy Ben, and with Indigenous community partners who are working with the community in an action-oriented way. And so the work I try to support is to bring together Indigenous scientists, faculty, and students with Indigenous community activists that are making change in the community every day. And so I'm honored to be part of this, and I really look forward to this conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Carletta. So we're gonna go ahead and hand off the opportunity for our panelists to present. Each will present for about 6 to 8 minutes. I will read off some of the questions, the framing questions that those who are presenting will speak on. So the first question is, what aspects of marine ecosystems and/or freshwater ecosystems are meaningful in your community? What changes are occurring in the marine and/or freshwater ecosystem, and how are these changes important to you, your work, and your community? How does science and sovereignty respond to these changes? And we'll go ahead and start with Natalie Michelle.
Hello, my name is Natalie Michelle. I'm from the Penobscot Nation, and my mother was from the Passamaquoddy Nation in the community in which I will be speaking of today. I found this question kind of difficult to answer, because in our own epistemology, all of the systems, everything, all life is sacred, and we all are interconnected. And so when I'm looking at what aspects of the marine system, and I think that most Indigenous communities run into that, well, you know, and especially in my research, when I asked them, you know, what is the most important for you to tackle right now in climate change? And they feel overwhelmed because where do they start? But everything is sacred, everything is important, not just one part of the ecosystem. Um, so the aspect of holism comes into the equation, you know, as far as indigenous communities and epistemology is concerned. But in terms of management, you know, then we run into the cultural triage. Where do we start? And so I think that in terms of the community where my mother was from, which is called Sibayak, um, and it's located right on the ocean in Eastport, Maine. And their native name instead of Passamaquoddy is Pescadamugati, which means the people who spear pollock. And they are part of the Wabanaki, which consist of 4 different tribes in Maine. And so, in looking at their uh, marine program, I think right now, in terms of management and you know, economic, both traditional economic and non-traditional economic aspects, the shellfish and the groundfish, um, in particular, and the porpoise, because the porpoises, we use those for not only for food, but they were part of our ceremonial gatherings and meetings of the Confederacy when we met. We always sent a runner out to get the porpoise meat because that was very important to open up the meetings. Um, but in terms of the shellfish, lobster is a biggie economically, not only for the indigenous fishers, but for the overall economy of Maine. Um, and the shellfish is the clam harvest. That's very important. Um, the people still live off from, you know, the shellfish, and the groundfish have basically been extirpated from the region. And a lot of these groundfish have moved deeper out into the oceans. So the people don't have access to them. Um, we used to get bucketfuls of flounder about 50 years ago right off the shore. Now they're non-existent. Um, so I guess that's it for me for that question. I think that very much so when you're looking at in terms of management, cultural triage needs to incorporate the holistic aspect of our epistemology when it comes to the ecosystems. So
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. We'll go on to Joe Hustler. You're muted. He's working on it. Great.
Okay. I think Ayukwi Nikna Joe Hustler. I work for the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program in Northwest California. I am a Yurok descendant, Talawa descendant on my father's side, and an enrolled member of the Confederate Tribes of Grand Round in Western Oregon on my mom's side. And I work for in Northwest California. We are both Yurok, as we call it. We are both marine and river people. So we have Nurtner or coastal Yuroks and the Pulikla or downriver, lower river Yurok. River is the, I think, 3rd largest river on the West Coast. We're about halfway between Portland and San Francisco and the Redwood Coast. So, but we have a number of issues with marine ecosystems changing, and also as well as our freshwater systems. The tribe, we are California's largest tribe, and that's over 6,000 members, and our reservation is about 57,000 acres, and we've been pretty active in reacquiring uplands, timberlands, about another 40,000 acres or so of timberlands that were ancestrally our lands that have been lost throughout General Allotment Act and other times. And so we've been trying to reacquire those lands and remanage them from indigenous perspective. We're still in the early phases, but related to our ecosystems, we're seeing significant changes in the ocean and the Pacific. The last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot of collapse of the kelp forests off the coast, and so those have been causing changes. And there's a lot of big changes going on in the ocean, and so climate change is exacerbate all the problems already. So we're as tribal members, our subsistence resources are beginning become more scarce. We have less availability and safety of shellfish. A lot of the mussels are toxic. Razor clams have been under quarantine for a few years now, so we haven't been able to harvest razor clams. And so a lot of these issues are kind of cascade into one another. And so within our environmental program, we try to monitor our shellfish. We go out and harvest them, and we harvest them, and we harvest them, and then we send them to the lab. California, we partner with California Department of Health, and so they monitor. They analyze the lab for us, and then we are able to tell if released to the public if it's safe or not, because the traditional windows are not always the safe times anymore because of the changes in the water. Um, so those all interplay with each other. With as Natalie mentioned about the holistic nature of our ecosystems, that the ocean is connected to our lands. Redwoods are integral to our culture. The only place in the world where redwoods remain, and so the redwoods rely on fog, and so that interplays with the kelp forests. And so one of our goals is to my coworkers, more so I do more upland stuff. My coworkers are working at, hopefully we're trying to work on restoring some of our kelp forests, because this is really drastic. There's been crazy amount of changes. The urchins are exploding, the little purple spiky fish that suck up the water on the bottom of the ocean. They're eating everything, and killing off the abalone, which are culturally significant for ceremony and as well as subsistence. And then also for the non-native people, the state is really worried about money and the agricultural value of commercial sales of these shellfish, whereas natives were more worried about generally more worried about subsistence. And then so if I could also shift into, because I mentioned like Yurok are also riverine, so we have a lot of issues on the water. The Klamath is like I said, one of the larger salmon fisheries on the West Coast. And we've really seen a collapse of salmon in the last, I don't know how many years or so, but with climate change just getting exacerbated, we have a lot of juvenile fish kills. And a big issue with that is actually more man-made, with hydroelectric dams on the river. So the tribe has been really aggressively trying to decommission 4 very large concrete earthen dams, and hopefully we will see them go in the near future. It would be the world's largest dam decommissioning. And we've been just kind of all hands on deck. Everybody in the organization and the tribe really woke up in 2002, I think it was. We had a major fish kill, and within our thousands of years since the beginning of time, we have never seen a fish kill like that, where like 50,000 adult salmon died in a little river before they're able to spawn. And so it was just really heartbreaking, and really woke us up that we need to do something. That if we always say that if the environment's sick, then also the people are also sick. So we have to work at trying to help our relations, salmon and plants and animals and the fish, make sure that they're healthy so that we can also be healthy as well. And so that's kind of a big issue that we're trying to deal with, is the dam decommissioning. But from under the dams is also harmful algal blooms. That the dams create stagnant water, and those create this neon green algae mats that if the free-flowing river would have a very small amount of algae in them, but when you have a dam that stops the water, it creates this bathtub effect. And in inland, you get away from the coast, it gets pretty hot. Like even today, it's supposed to be like 190, like up into 100 degrees today inland, just a few miles inland. So that stagnant water gets hot, and then the algae, the nutrient loading from agriculture, makes the algae bloom. And so that those algae, when they die, are harmful, or liver toxins and tumor promoters. And so all that water flows downriver to us. And that also coincides when the salmon are running. So the fishermen and fisherwomen are exposed to water at the worst time of the year when the algae are toxic. And so one of the byproducts of having the dams is this toxic algae. And so we've been trying to, one way to solve this problem is just to remove the dams. And so we've been really hopefully it was supposed to start later this year, and then it's got pushed back to 2021 now. And then now even with the new, anyway, it becomes political and legal. And so all in all, we're persistent. We're not going anywhere. So we're going to keep fighting these things and trying to make these things correct. And so I guess that's where I'll leave off for now. But just one thing is that we also try to integrate Western science with our traditional knowledge. We work with our elders on asking, getting guidance from our elders and asking about what is the environment supposed to be like? What was it like within your time? And getting guidance about what we can share with outside people, what we cannot share. I'm a real big personal advocate for sharing and protecting traditional knowledge, that there is a proper way to share knowledge, and that we have to be careful about what we share, and and be careful about the way we approach these things, and build relationships with trust, and working with outsiders in a respectful way, so that they can be respectful with us and build that relationship and have that trust, so that we can all work together and solve these problems together. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Joe. There's so many similarities that I am hearing from both you and Natalie that also we're experiencing here in the Pacific Northwest area, and just your comments about and then touching on the wholeness too, just very large landscape and ecosystem wide, the interconnectedness of all of these things, and as well as just the complexities of everything. There's so many different players and different kinds of impacts that when they're coming all together create this large cumulative effect. So we wanted to go back to Natalie for just a moment to share a few extra words before moving on to the other speakers. Go ahead, Natalie. Natalie, you are muted.
Some of the changes that we're seeing up here in the Northeast are an increase in the ocean temperatures and increased temperatures in the river systems and the waterways, ocean acidification and the loss of habitat, overharvesting by the commercial fisheries, and pollution runoffs and toxins. In the increase in ocean temperature, we're seeing new species coming in. Our native species are moving north into the cooler waters. In the river systems, we're seeing the trout moving and the salmon moving up. In the ocean acidification, it's affecting our shellfish here. They're not developing their shells the way that they should. So the survival rate is affected on that. With the loss of habitat, we have the extirpation of various species, particularly the groundfish. The over-harvesting by the commercial fisheries are impacting our scallops here. And the traditional harvesters, the native men, saw this years ago and tried to warn the state of Maine, and the state of Maine wouldn't consider their traditional knowledge in that. And about a year after that, the scallop industry collapsed. I think that the state of Maine are slowly coming around to listening to the traditional harvesters. It's still a struggle because our native science isn't considered in a lot of ways. The pollution runoff and the toxins, we have red tide here. And it affects the shellfish fisheries, especially the clams, and a lot of the people who, the subsistence harvesters, depend on the clams for their dinner at night and for their families. And a lot of times when the red tide is in, and I think it's around the time right now for red tide, they can't harvest. And, one of the biggest problems with them is that, there's a high rate of poverty there, like you've never seen. And so a lot of families go without as a result of not having access to these fisheries. And that's a big concern for me. My undergraduate work is in human nutrition and nursing. So it's a big concern for me for child health and growth and development. There are some of the fishers there use this as a supplemental wage. When they don't have access to the fisheries, that becomes a real big problem. We have high unemployment rate, decrease to the use of the internet or technology and transportation. So they can't go other places to fish and harvest because they have no way to get there. Subsistence harvesting has been pretty much off the table with DMR, particularly in the commercial harvesting areas. They can't go out and harvest. They can only harvest on the territorial tribal front, which is only about a 2.5 mile coastal stretch. And they have one of the biggest problems there is that they have their water treatment center there. So it's kind of iffy trying to harvest shellfish from those areas. Of course, the traditional foods are central to the cultural expression and identity and spiritualism and physical well-being. They are presently looking at solutions of ethical harvest and good health through our 7 fire prophecies and teachings to revitalize and remembering ourselves as part of Nigwaskikdamig, Mother Earth. And we need a greater universal acknowledgement of our own 7-generation policy and what that is by national and state regulators. And so I think that the ways that we're trying to respond up here is through Indigenous scholar research. And it's brought about a new, a greater awareness of the cultural implication as a result of the loss of access to our ancestors, and the ability to transmit that ecological knowledge to our younger generations through our language. We have environmental justice activities that have shed light on Indigenous rights here, to the water systems and its importance to our identity and cultural survival as a nation. The communities have co-partnership with the University of Maine to provide services and expertise on climate change mitigation and the best science practices in conservation. We have the WAYS program, who recruits youths to become more involved in environmental issues within their own communities. And we encourage them to learn citizen science and to sit down and talk with our elders and learn about the teachings that through our cultural species, through story, song, and ceremony. We do the water ceremony here all of the time. We have aquaculture projects at Sibayak that have started a number of restoration projects on their own, looking at the seaweed, and the Elver, the glass eel project. And then we have the Alewives project, which is very important because a lot of our ocean fronts and waterways have been impacted by industry here from pollution. And alewives is a keystone species to our rivers here. And they provide nutrition to the ecology, but it was also a very important food source for us, for our essential fatty acids, for our neurological development in our youth and pregnant women. I did a project, a cranberry project, and that's on the bog system, a stream system. And these are very important food sources, traditional food sources for our people, the cranberries. And it also, the sphagnum moss system, the bog system, is a very important carbon sink. And the problems that I picked up through that research is that we're having a lot. I had the plants analyzed for their constituent, their nutrient content. And one of the things that I found in that particular, those particular tests, they were high in aluminum. And so we're having a lot of fallout into the streams and lakes and the waterbeds here of aluminum. And that becomes a concern because we all know what, aluminum has been connected with: cancer and neurological diseases. And then we have a very high increase in nitrogen fallout of the atmosphere here. So another thing that concerns me is how is that impacting our carbon sinks here, the sphagnum bogs, because it's a very important carbon sink up here in this area. And not only that, but it's not, how is it affecting these symbiotic systems, these symbiotic water systems, such as the stream, the cranberry bog connection, because it's the cranberries that supply the sphagnum moth with nitrogen. It's a symbiotic relationship. So it's nutrifying these environments. And how is it affecting that is a good research question for another Indigenous scholar to pick up and start looking at. And in these kind of programs, like looking at it from a climate change point of view, because it's so interlinked with our culture, it's hard and it's difficult to get funding for these kinds of projects because the different agencies are so siloed. They don't look at the holistic aspect of our culture when it comes to these studies with the environment. They're very much a part of our food systems. They're very much a part of our ecosystems and our cultural survival. But yet it's very difficult applying for funds from here or there because they don't look at those connections and those linkages, and they don't get funded. So I think that that's something that needs to be considered in these federal agencies who are funding and these national agencies that are funding Native American projects in the environment. So that's all I have, Melissa.
That's excellent, Natalie. I appreciate all of that additional context you provided, particularly just with the context of the national and state management and relationships and funding, and call out for how those processes can be improved. And while you were talking, I was thinking too about how COVID and this pandemic has affected these processes. I know in Washington, a lot of our, we have huge economic dependence on aquaculture and shellfish and seafood. And with the shutdown and the global pandemic, there's been a really large impact on those systems and for both for tribal fisheries and non-tribal commercial fisheries. And so I know COVID is likely also an impact to all of the folks who are on this call and in the work that we do. And if there's a potential, perhaps somebody might have a question around that. Those who are listening in, be sure to use the chat box to ask any questions that you have for any of our panelists. And we're going to hand it over to Carletta. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I like Natalie was saying that it's very difficult to separate marine ecosystems from freshwater systems. And so we recognize that, but also that we want to also highlight some of the impacts and partnerships across both of these types of systems. And so now going to shift over to the freshwater systems and start out with my sister, Janine Yazzie, who works a lot at the community level to talk about the impacts at the community level and how water systems is meaningful in her community. And then the importance of community sovereignty, data sovereignty, and sciences. And then I'll also, after she finishes, then I'll also have Dr. Otokoye Conroy-Ben talk about her work in the sciences and how she works with her community as it relates to that partnership, community university partnerships. So go ahead, Janine, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, Shade. Yat Shike, Yat everyone. It's an honor to be here and be engaged in such an important panel and discussion. As Dr. Chief said, my older sister, I've been working for the last 10 years on building pathways to restore traditional ecological practices in landscape and ecosystem management, particularly in my community here on the Navajo Nation, with the goal being promoting and nurturing water sovereignty and food security. I've done this by developing my own consultancy, Six World Solutions, but for the last 5 years, we've amplified that work to work at the international level as Sustainable Development Coordinator for International Indian Treaty Council and as co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, which is engaged in a high-level political forum on the Sustainable Development Goals. And doing all of this work and bringing all of these different issues and intersections together, we helped co-found the first Navajo Nation community-led watershed planning project called the Little Colorado River Watershed Chapters Association, which operated from 2012 to 2016. And so most of my work on the ground has been in the highland arid deserts of the Southwest United States, where our freshwater ecosystems are extremely precious and also particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, as well as other historical challenges created by overuse, exploitation, and contamination. When I was in college, I started to work on the intersection of human rights, indigenous rights, and climate change. And just with everything that I was learning from a global perspective, I knew that at home here in the Southwest, the cumulative impacts of both all of the environmental extraction and contamination, along with climate change, required us to organize immediately for extensive holistic systems-based planning for effective mitigation and adaptation responses to support the continued survival of our communities and the Navajo Nation as a whole. As already alluded to, that in the midst of COVID, we're still having to carry a lot of these priorities and a lot of these issues in our communities. Not only has that looked like the emergence of the Navajo Nation as a hotspot, which has been extremely, extremely scary and harrowing to deal with, but we've also had to deal with the continued impacts of climate change and the disappearance of and overuse of a lot of water resources here on the Navajo Nation, leading to the drying up of a lot of our community wells. And so our freshwater systems that are really important to our communities include our springs, our rivers, and our lakes. And the challenges that are present in restoring our traditional ecological practices are directly rooted in the history and legacy of colonization, which has led to the siphoning off, the monopolization, the privatization of a lot of these freshwater ecosystems, but has also translated over time into very confusing jurisdictional and regulatory frameworks that have slowly eroded and taken away community sovereignty. And that community sovereignty is key in exercising local authority and control in the management of these resources. And so when effective long-term management and sustainability is rooted in community capacity, it's really important for us to address these things at their root cause and ensure that we're building the capacity of communities that are directly dependent upon them based on their own identified priorities and vision for the use of those ecosystems and the management of those ecosystems. And so, science-based research is always important, but it becomes meaningless if it does not have that direct tie to community. And we've seen this with the accumulation of studies, of data and research that is filling up all of these archives, but never gets translated into and is never accessible by communities. And does it get translated in a way that communities can use it to achieve their resource goals and resource sustainability? And this is what makes data sovereignty so important. I've had the honor and pleasure of working with Dr. Chief with the LCRWCA for spring stewardship. And I think in that one project, we really highlighted the importance of organizing. And from this intersection of community sovereignty, data sovereignty, sciences, and traditional ecological knowledge, most most conversations around water and water security focused on domestic water use and issues of access. And this is just, rooted in this overdependence we have on groundwater and the prioritization of pipe water infrastructure as long-term solutions, which ignores centuries of land conflicts and complicated jurisdictional authorities and confusion over who's responsible for the actual management of these resources, and have all compounded to lead to the neglect of these important resources. And so, with a lot of the work that we've done on the ground, including with the Gold King mine spill study, as well as with just investigating the legacy of uranium contamination in our communities, we've seen that it's not just about access and use of these water systems, but about all of the cultural and spiritual uses of these systems for our communities and for our holistic well-being. So for us, it's really important to continue this path of promoting water sovereignty and taking care of freshwater ecosystems, using traditionally based practices, restoring traditional responsibilities and decision-making processes and authorities to conserve the use of and address water pollution issues affecting these vital resources. And this includes restoration of biological diversity and ecosystem functions, the protection of habitat, and the management of invasive species, as well as a lot of wild foods and wild medicines that are often found around these water resources. And so in doing this work, what has been really helpful is utilizing international human rights standards, and especially the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to help restore and enforce these inherent rights, because at best, domestic policy falls short when it comes to recognizing and supporting these rights, but at worst, it intentionally obstructs the application and continued traditional uses of these resources, because so much of our infrastructure, so much of our policies and our regulatory authorities are developed to support resource monopolization and privatization, especially on Indigenous lands. And so when we're talking about these systems, it's important to not only understand that it is possible and necessary to bridge traditional ecological knowledges and practices and sciences with Western sciences, but it's also important to remember that ultimately our very dependence on these systems is not only tied to our physical health, but also to our spiritual health as well. In building this work and in doing this work and ensuring that in everything that we're doing, we're facilitating the transference of knowledge from our elder generations to our younger generations as climate change actors and change agents. It's become very clear that to take care of the water is medicine, because it leads and requires us to also take care of ourselves and of all life. And I hope that we can continue to build these types of partnerships and conversations to facilitate best practices and how to best do that, and to share information and knowledge across all of our peoples and the water systems that we are tied to and that we come from, so that we can build more effective mitigation and adaptation efforts to climate change, but also alternatives to development that really prioritize the preciousness of this vital life-giving source.
Thank you, Janine. I think that was some real powerful statements that you had in there, especially as it relates to community capacity building, and really that any of the work that is done, especially in science, it doesn't really mean much unless it empowers the community. So I felt that to be a real powerful statement. And just your story of working with your own community early on and building that capacity with the elder knowledge and involving the youth, and then all the way up to the international level to try to deconstruct these policies that don't really support that type of community action, which involves the traditional elders and that transfer of knowledge to the youth so that they can also be empowered. So thank you so much for sharing the work that you're doing. And now I'd like to have our next panelist talk about her work Dr. Otake Conroy Ben, who has a very different perspective of freshwater systems, being that she works at looking at freshwater water quality at the very end of use. So specifically wastewater. And her connection to working in that space with her community, the Lakota Nation. And so I like to hear from her in terms of what water systems are meaningful in her community, being that she is a water scientist, and her role in the community sovereignty, data sovereignty, and especially the sciences in responding to these changes and the impacts to freshwater. Okay, I'll turn it over to Dr. Conroy Ben. Go ahead.
Thank you, Carletta, and to the rest of the panel for the invitation. I'm going to give, like Carletta said, a different perspective, one that I'm a wastewater engineer. I study water quality and the impacts of wastewater pollution on natural systems. Also, I consider myself, I'm a tribal member, but I am coming from the research academic side, more of a Western science approach. So my work focuses around the Clean Water Act, which was implemented by the federal government, enforced by the Environmental Protection Agency, which ensures fishable and swimmable surface water, as well as other bodies of water. And as a wastewater engineer, we're looking at collection systems coming from industrial waste, from municipal households, from agriculture. So we're looking at collection systems and how the pollutants in these waters, which are basically allowed to be discharged into rivers and oceans, how does that impact the natural system? So I want to talk a little bit about just some general wastewater treatment. We have like sewer pipes coming in to these large wastewater treatment facilities, and EPA only mandates that we remove total solids, which are the large objects, or it can be microbes, as well as BOD, which is organic waste. And under the Clean Water Act, there are no specific provisions for removing targeted chemicals. Because we're dealing with sewage, human pathogens do have the potential to be discharged into the environment. So there is typically a disinfection process at the end of this treatment train before it's discharged into the environment. So in my previous research life, what I have been looking at are endocrine disruptors, which are organic micropollutants arising from humans, as well as our just practices that make their way to wastewater treatment facilities and are not completely removed, so they get back out in the environment once discharged. So these endocrine disruptors that are problematic include human hormones. So women will excrete estrogen, men will excrete androgens. There are hormone mimics, such as the BPA plasticizer. There's pharmaceuticals. We're finding more nano and microparticles, flame retardants, pathogens, antibiotic-resistant genes, drugs of abuse, et cetera, et cetera. So in my research, I'm measuring the removal of these through wastewater as well as the discharge into the environment. And so why are these problematic? Well, it's been documented worldwide that these endocrine disruptors are causing intersex fish. So they're causing male fish to acquire female characteristics because they're being exposed to microgram to nanogram per liter levels of human hormones and hormone mimics. There are also, the plasticizers, which can induce this. There are, pharmaceuticals. We're finding antibiotic resistance genes in water that we may want to reuse for agriculture. And so I've developed these skills, and what I want to do is ultimately work with tribal communities. And so I'm at a stage in my career where I can do that. In the past, where the Clean Water Act has played a role is the San Francisco Peaks issue and Snow Bowl, where the skiing company wanted to reuse wastewater as a snowmaking source. Well, it turns out there are many pollutants in that reused wastewater, and that can have the impact of accumulating in soil as well as into traditional medicines and impacting the water runoff. There are tribes in the Northwest that are concerned about wastewater pollution impacting salmon breeding, because it is documented that these pollutants can wipe out fish populations. And other studies nationwide along the Missouri River, Mississippi River, perhaps tribal communities living along these waterways. They are seeing evidence of these micropollutants entering their waterways because these wastewater treatment plants do discharge to these rivers. What do I think about working with tribal communities? So as an academic, it's important to build that trust to develop that relationship. So I first started working with my tribe, the Oglala Sioux tribe on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, where we're looking at different pollutants in wastewater as well as the treatment through different systems and the impacts on some culturally significant waterways that they use in some ceremonies. And I'm also partnering with some other tribes in Arizona, and what I'm finding is that it takes time to develop that trust, to not be so, university, dissemination focused, where we have to publish and present. It's important to work with the community and try to understand what their needs are and know that this is for their health, their preservation of environment. And so I've had to do just a lot of, conducting some meetings with different tribal stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the work that I do, a lot of research I do really doesn't get out there, it doesn't get published, but it is for the benefit of the tribe, and they're making their own decisions with what to do with the data. As far as future work, working with these other tribes where wastewater discharge is occurring, what I recommend is to test for other indicators. Caffeine, if you go out and test for water, you find caffeine, that's a good indication that that waterway is polluted by wastewater. Definitely the hormones, antibiotic resistance genes. We're also looking at drugs of abuse. We're finding tramadol, cocaine, methamphetamine in water in these culturally significant waters. And touching back on a comment earlier about coronavirus, testing is underway in several tribal communities where we're looking at wastewater influent as well as the effluent to see if we will likely find coronavirus in these waterways. So we're going to figure out what's the best way to treat this pathogen as well as other pathogens. I want to maybe discuss what some of these other questions that were posed to us. So what is meaningful in what I do? So basically I'm looking at the fate of wastewater pollution in tribal communities. since these are not regulated pollutants, there's going to be no money going to these efforts. And so that's where I see my place in this community is. What changes are happening at the tribal level? What I think we're going to be seeing is accumulation of these pollutants in wastewater impacted water, which is basically every surface water source. And how does science and sovereignty respond? I think it's important to just get more water testing done in tribal communities. There's a lot of this testing going on in non-tribal communities, and this is a very underserved area looking at these pollutants. I think that's where I want to leave it. Like I said, it's a matter of just taking the time to work with communities and working with the environmental offices, the water, wastewater directors on just getting a clear motivation and getting a good understanding of, you know, what is out there, what Western science can offer, but also what can the community offer to academic researchers. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for your time. If those that are on the call can unmute themselves or use the emojis, let's do a round of applause, or however it is that you acknowledge people's time. Thank you so much, everybody. Thumbs up are great. Awesome. So we're gonna take some time to go into some questions that have been asked in the chat box. And I'm going to go ahead and start with one that could be addressed by any of our 4 panelists. And that is how do we address the way that Western scientific funding silos prohibit Indigenous holistic views for research and restoration?
It's hard to answer that question because first off, they need to burst themselves into tribal epistemology. And a lot of the federal agencies, I will have to say, probably just don't have the time to do that, and because it takes a commitment in order to really understand our perspectives. And maybe even some of them are just not interested in learning that. And so I think that that's a very important aspect on, you know, how do we get them to come around to understand that our perspectives on the ecology is a holistic perspective, and that some of these science-based or science-based cultural research efforts have to be focused towards that understanding.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I feel like in my experience, being a community partner in several research projects, it's not so much about having to change the funding institutions themselves, but of just doing it, just implementing it, and bringing in those community partners, bringing in those Indigenous researchers that already have that understanding of the cultural, socioeconomic context in the communities that they are working in. But there are opportunities and frameworks that I know of in our international work that could be used domestically as well, like reappropriating these terms that are intended to mean the same thing as holistic systems approach, but don't necessarily translate into that in actual work. But taking those terms like systems-based approaches, agroecology, like the frameworks around that, restoring biological diversity and the importance that is to climate change adaptation and mitigation, have all created doorways and pathways for increased recognition of traditional ecological knowledge and practices and Indigenous-based sciences and worldviews. And I think we need to continue to push for advancement and recognition of that domestically here, particularly in the United States or in other developed nations, because there's support of it on an international level when it comes to Indigenous peoples elsewhere. But we really need our advocates, our scientists, our policymakers to work for that type of recognition here. And I think Rising Voices is an incredible example of how that has worked across in identifying different opportunities to expand definition, to open those doors for traditional knowledge holders and community-based participatory research, and in every aspect of addressing environmental or science, environmental concerns, our science-based approaches to addressing and understanding those concerns. And I think it's just going to continue we just need to continue to commit towards building off of that progress and ensuring that these things are done in a specific way that honors the cultural knowledge and the context of the communities that this research is being conducted in.
Yeah, very great. Very inspiring, Janine. I just wanted to add in one thing that I could add into, I guess, just how we do downriver, we call it with Yurok, is just kind of piecemeal. I think kind of this is a really big, like, long-term question solution, and I kind of see two tracks to it. There's systematic change that needs to happen, which can take a long time. But then also, as we deal with like climate change, coming upon us already and changing our ecosystem so dramatically, we're seeing these changes right now. How do we deal with these? And so one thing that we've been able to do, or tried to do, is just piecemeal, like take a small research project over here, small research project grant here, put them together, and just kind of have this umbrella type thought process that's more holistic in a sense, and then just trying to tackle it piecemeal. Within a tribe too, or at least, for my tribe, a number of tribes also, is that as an organization, we're pretty limited in capacity. We're short staffed, we have minimal dollars, we have all these different things. So in a sense, it's like trying to tackle it piecemeal. And so I guess if you kind of put it, I always say, like a puzzle, try and put these different research projects together and, make them work together. Like, been able, like our adaptation planning, we've been doing little pieces here, and then once we got like a big grant, we're able to put it all together, and then now the implementation part comes. But I think it's just trying to be adaptable and creative. Indigenous people, we're adaptive, and so just got to keep being adaptive. I don't know.
Excellent. Yeah, I was, Carla, too. I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I was going to share some of my own thoughts, and that I think one of the things that we can do to support that systematic change that you're talking about, Joe, is we need to fund and support Indigenous peoples as leaders and scholars in this work. The traditional knowledge holders, acknowledging that traditional knowledge and Indigenous peoples are scientists and are own very important ways. I think that long-term trajectory, we can, ultimately shift that perspective. I work with, some great folks. Where I'm working on a project right now that addresses ocean acidification, and the social science work is led by Dr. Melissa Poe, and we are partnering with 4 coastal treaty tribes in Washington State, and really implementing, my own lens of Indigenous scholarship. As an Indigenous scholar, how do I make sure that I'm implementing my own, protocols and best practices for working with other Indigenous peoples, and ensure that that's also incorporated as part of the overall plan for working with tribes. And I think ultimately we, are implementing a plan that I am proud of, and observed that community-based participatory process where tribes, own the data. They are leading those decisions that are made. They're they're participating and leading the conversations. These are the kinds of ways that we can shift how we're integrating Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And I know a lot of the folks on this call and within Rising Voices too are really leading a lot of those efforts. So a lot of gratitude for that work. Before I move on to the next question, did anyone have any follow-ups to this discussion? All right, great. So we had a question come in that was around, I think, related to dams specifically, in response to Joe's conversation. Though I think that it could be, you know, I could see this coming into for the, you know, treatment of wastewater and other aspects that were discussed on the call today. But can the is it possible to reintroduce native or indigenous fish and other species in our water systems if we do remove dams and do restore our water systems? And you know, what happens when we're at a point where a lot of these native um, native species might already be close to extinction?
Yeah, I guess for us anyway, we're fortunate here on the North Coast, Northwest California, that some of our species are extrapolated. They're already gone. Like candlefish, we don't have Ooligan anymore. We used to. Those are long gone. I don't know if we'll be able to restore them or not. But I think part of it is just you know, managing in a crisis, just trying to help those that are still around. I mean, we have these tipping points that we're near, and so we're just trying to hold on to the ones, just trying to help our relatives, our non-human relatives, survive as well, and so give them opportunities. And I think I kind of like a cliche is like, if you build it, they will come. I mean, you know, if we build these habitats, you know, fish especially are very resilient. We've seen up in Washington State with the Elwha Dam. You know, it's really inspiring for us down here is to see, like, you know, they tore down big dams and the fish went back to where they used to, you know, and it had been like 100 years or generations, many generations for a 5 year life cycle for a fish, but they're there. And so it's inspiring that, you know, nature is resilient. And if you give nature, you know, opportunities that they'll come back. And so, I mean, you know, we have to make sure we don't screw that up. But um, I think that is just a responsibility that we have, I think, as humans into our relations, is that we need to help them help themselves in a sense.
I'd also like to say, Melissa, can you hear me? I'd also like to add that, you know, I've been out in the environment since COVID-19 because I'm so sick of staying in the house and isolating. And I go out, and one thing that I've noticed since COVID-19 is that the air and the water are clearer now, and the ocean temperatures are cooler since everything has shut down. And we have an infestation of green crabs up here. And I was down to Arcadia, and there was a lot of green crabs on the west side of Arcadia last year. But this year, when I went into the water, I didn't see one. So I don't know if it's because of cooler temperatures, or you know, they're moving, or somebody's harvesting them. But I did definitely notice that the ocean waters and the lake waters are clearer since COVID-19. So it's a good, you know, there are some good things coming out of this, and the air is definitely cleaner.
How about any of the others in terms of, thanks for those comments, Natalie. I was just going to say too that we have European green crabs that are also being invasive and infesting our Northwest waters. And I'll have to check in with our green crab team to see if they've observed any changes over time since COVID-19. But I think the other panelists may have responses to a question similar to this, and that, you know, if we were to restore our freshwater ecosystems in some ways, will that support the reintegration of some of our native species? Or perhaps even the terrestrial plants or traditional foods that your communities might be relying on?
All right. I'll take a shot. Fine. I think that that's the hope, right? Like that is the goal. But it's been really interesting doing this work. And an example I'll bring is like in Ganado, we have a creek that runs through Black Creek. And one of the things that we collected in doing our community work were oral histories and oral stories of beavers that used to live in that waterway, and different things that people used to learn from and draw from in terms of our creation stories, and just how we gained knowledge and built knowledge off of observing other species and creatures and their habits and behaviors, and how a lot of that was gone, and we are now dealing with generations of youth who are under the age of 15 who had no idea that beavers ever existed in their community. And so being able to just even restore those stories and bring back what those relationships look like was really healing in its own way. And I think that when we see the physical reintroduction, the bringing back of these plant and animal species, that is an indication of something being restored to its healthy natural state. But it's also been complicated because we're dealing with issues of pervasive invasive species, whether we're talking about terrestrial or aquatic. And one of the things that has been brought up is that the looking at plants and animals as invasive is also a Western construct, and that our traditional knowledge systems dictate that plants and animals and ecosystems themselves are living, moving, like independent entities, and that these entities themselves aren't restricted to any man-made borders, are understanding of geology and geography, and that with invasive species, maybe the goal is not to completely restore a habitat back to its like pristine natural state, which is like a white Western conservationist view of nature, but to look at how did we just restore the balance with what life is there. And so I think that as we move forward and as we're given more opportunity to exercise community sovereignty and restoration of traditional knowledge systems, we'll start to confront these things and these seemingly contradictions even more, in order to find out what that balance pathway is. Because I do think that there's some wisdom in that, understanding that maybe our goal and our objective should just be to restore balance with what life is already present.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Janine. I think that point about balance is really important. It reminds me about how in Washington we have, as I said before, a lot of aquaculture. And so we have the native oysters in the area. But we've also have some other oysters that have grown really well in the area that are more popular for commercial uses because they're a little bit larger. And so what we've actually found, though, in the last few years is that those oysters that haven't traditionally been grown or raised in this region are being much more impacted by ocean acidification and changes in the ocean environment than the native oysters. And so I think it's kind of a way where some of that balance is coming into play, where those species that have been in the area have much more resilience than those that are not used to this region. So I appreciate that comment.
Melissa, I think you bring up a really great point about what it means. What does resilience mean for our communities? And the resilience of our communities and the ecosystems for both marine and freshwater has a different meaning, and it includes all these different factors we mentioned. That is holistic, from our social and cultural, our cultural and spiritual values, the ecosystems and the way we use the land, and the natural laws that exist within our communities that are held by the traditional knowledge holders. And so resilience in our communities has a very different meaning. And like Janine was saying, the return to a balance and recovery is also part of that resilience, which is not the same as others would try to define outside of our community. So I think it's a really important point that was discussed today, that we have our own definitions, our own ways of knowing, our own life ways and concepts of resilience that needs to be recognized at the global and international levels, and the work that is done to deconstruct the policies, like as Janine was saying, that don't often fit these our own ways within our indigenous communities.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, I'll go ahead and close this with one more question that anyone can respond to, and then Carletta will close us out for the day. We wanted to add some clarification or even just thoughts around the idea of what does it mean to take time to understand Indigenous perspectives from, if you're coming from Western science. Also, in the fact that it's essential and necessary to build that understanding when working with Indigenous communities, and not just something that's, extra curricular or something that you just need to check a box on. Natalie, is that okay? Go ahead, Joe. Thank you.
I guess I could just try to chime in something. Is doing climate adaptation planning kind of long. One thing that was really helpful for me was just understanding timescales and realizing that sometimes the work that we do, we don't even see the benefit of. That we do this work for future generations that we may not even see the benefit of it for ourselves in our lifetimes. But the idea is that we do the work with that hope that in the future it will be better. As Indigenous people, we're always optimistic. I mean, I think that's been through so much that you have to stay optimistic regardless of how grim it may look. But I think it's just that those time scales are different, and realizing that selflessness, that the work that we do is not always for our own benefit, but for the future as well.
I can rephrase the question too. So why is it necessary or critical that when working, in partnership, or when non-Indigenous scientists are in collaboration with Indigenous communities, why is it important to build an understanding of that Indigenous perspective and viewpoint, or at least the background and histories of Indigenous communities, in order to be successful in that kind of collaboration? Okay, I got comments that this is a confusing question. So maybe what we can do is just take a little bit of time to ask if anyone has any closing thoughts or remarks, and then we can go into the closing with Carletta. So I just wanted to say thank you all so much for your time. This has been a really enriching conversation for me. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to learn both from Joe and Natalie in particular around the kinds of different experiences and similarities that the communities in your different parts of the world are experiencing related to the marine environment. And then as well with our other guests, learning about how these connect with the freshwater ecosystems. Also wanted to thank Julie and Heather for the time and the invitation to participate in this conversation. And I look forward to our dialogue in a couple of weeks.
I'll share some closing thoughts, kind of thinking about the question that you asked at the end. I think it's really important that every scientist and researcher, especially our non-native scientists and researchers, understand that regardless of the perceived objectivity of science, there are underlying assumptions and biases that can come out in conceptualizing what the problem is when looking at especially environmental issues. And for Indigenous peoples and successful partnerships with Indigenous peoples, it's not only important for a successful partnership to have a respectful, equal decision-making partnership, but also to understand that this is the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to build their responses, their approaches, their methodologies, their decision-making processes off of their unique worldviews, which are place-based specific. And I think an important guiding question in beginning research is, what is the research for? What is it supposed to be accomplishing? But most scientists I know are trying to accomplish some sort of beneficial change to a problem, a resource problem that they're seeing. But there has been history of research being done for the sake of knowledge, and that has not always led to a beneficial impact to the communities that are often the subject of this research. But I think we're living in a different time where people are definitely invested in real systemic change and real climate solutions and climate answers. And to do that, there's a lot to be learned from Indigenous peoples who are conserving and stewarding and taking care of 80% of the world's remaining biological diversity. And so to go into those partnerships and relationships with any type of assumption that marginalizes or erases the contribution of those knowledge systems is to start off with the wrong foot and perpetuating cycles of violence and of erasure that have marginalized Indigenous peoples to this point, and then cannot afford those cycles. We need to break those cycles in order to progress to a more sustainable, holistic future for all life.
I think the big question that a lot of the non-native scientists have is, how do they validate our knowledge? I think that that's the big discrepancy there. And our knowledge is always evolving. It's not stagnant. And our knowledge, base comes from various understandings within our communities, significant kinship ties or clan systems or even gender systems have different knowledges about a specific resource, and a different view on it. And I think that that's a way to answer that question of validity of our science, is to go out there and make it purposeful to get these different various views and perspectives on the natural resources of our ancestors, because that is a way of cross-checking and utilizing the method of cross-checking in science. Just follow the basic scientific guidelines of qualitative research, and you will get your answer. And instead of trying to take a snapshot and saying, and trying to quantify it. And our knowledge and our science cannot be quantified. And so I think that it's an acceptance of coming around to a qualitative approach to study. So that's my answer as a researcher, that one knowledge base will complement the other. You just got to take the time.
Okay, if I could I forgot one other idea I had was kind of a plug, I guess, in a sense, is I worked with Carletta before on our traditional knowledges guidelines. I think some of that has some really useful information for building relationships, guidelines in a sense of like how non-native researchers could collaborate with tribes, and just some things to think about in building a relationship with tribes. from understandings that a lot of times in one of my previous jobs was as a tribal liaison, and it's just knowing what that, as my friend Preston Hardison from Tulalip always says, that there's a front door that you always know that front door exists, and you go to that front door. And so non-native researchers need to understand, well, where is that front door? And so often that may be tribal council, but maybe tribal council is too busy. If you send, a Dear Tribal Chairman letter, it may go into a stack of 300 other Dear Tribal Chairman letters. And so just trying to be open and be persistent in a sense. Building relationships doesn't happen overnight, so it takes time. And then as we deal with with projects, tribes often don't think in a grant timeline. They don't think in a 2, 3, 5 year timeline. We're thinking generational or longer term. And so as a researcher, you may not have a great project that the tribe is available to work at right now, but that doesn't mean in the future they won't. And so just having that openness. And then just my kind of last little farewell, I guess, as we're getting past time, is just thank you to Rising Voices for allowing me to come speak. Really admire the work that you guys do. Finally get to talk with Rising Voices and never get to travel to the meetings, but I'm happy to be here, and thank you guys. Thank you for all the speakers. Learned a lot. Thank you. Two.
Yeah, if I could add just another, what should researchers do? I'll just take it back a step for these non-Indigenous researchers is, you develop those relationships, but really just make sure you have, the right people on the project. Make sure you have your approvals. Make sure you know what their data dissemination policies are. I go into projects, valuing water. I'm not going to collect or analyze for anything I'm not supposed to. And I understand that the water belongs to the tribe, and any data coming from that water sample belongs to the tribe as well. So I think it's important that researchers understand that. So I'd like to thank Rising Voices as well as Carletta for inviting me to participate.
I want to thank our panelists today for sharing with us today their important work, and that especially they do with their communities, the importance of marine and freshwater systems for their communities. Joe Hostler from Yurok Tribe in the Northwest, Natalie Michelle from Pasquama Tiki in the Northeast, focusing on marine water systems, and Janine Yazi Shadeja from Six World Solutions from the Navajo Nation in the Southwest. And my friend, Dr. Takuya Conroy Ben, a professor in environmental engineering at Arizona State University from the Great Oglala Lakota Sioux, for both of them working in the freshwater systems. We talked about the importance of water systems for our culture, subsistence activities, and then prioritizing traditional epistemology, traditional knowledge, the importance of involving our elders all the way to our youth, deconstructing Western international policies, and the use of science in these contexts that prioritize Indigenous values and lifeways. So this panel session that we had today will build towards the water system full working group session on Friday, August 21st, where we'll have breakout discussion sessions, one for marine ecosystems and one for freshwater ecosystems, to discuss this session further. So I want to also thank all of those across the nation and the world who joined us today in this virtual Rising Voices Water session today. On behalf of Rising Voices, I want to send well wishes of health, safety, and blessings to you, your family, your communities. And we look forward to discussing this further in the working group water sessions. Ahehe and hagone. Thank you.
5 o'clock alarm bell rings, same thing every day. They'll answer the phone, I'm not home, I'm already on my way. Out the door, down the street, got to keep me on my feet. I got coffee, I got donuts, in the office down the street. And the fat hat lady's faking a heart attack. And my manager yelling at me, say, can't give her money back. Bank called for notice overdue. And that's just one more thing I gotta do. Till I get on to you. Till I get on to you. 12 o'clock, the lunch bell rings. Same thing every day. You better answer the phone in the proper tone. Yes, sir, whatever you say. Right on time, on the time. Got to keep me on my feet. I got contracts, I got lawyers in the office down the street. Bank jam is backing up, holding out can stand. Things ain't working out the way I had them planned. Bank on the meeting, just a drink or two. That's just one more thing I gotta do. Till I get on to you. Till I get on to you. The happy hour, sipping on no whiskey sour. Bartender asking about a refill, and I'm wondering who's paying the bill. The ladies be heating the call, sugar papers, one and all. My boss be dancing on the dance floor, so I'm heading out that door. And I'm making my move, I'm breaking out this bar. And I'm getting my groove on, I'm driving home in my car. And the blue light comes flashing into view.